I think your dogs would kill themselves if they didn't have someone around.
Okay, well, welcome to class. This will be the final lecture in the class presentations by me. And so under normal class conditions, I would have presented more lectures and we would have had a little more material on marine communities. But we've had the chance to look at two varieties of marine communities to date. The first was applied to the fish community, the pelagic and the benthic fish community, which is so important for human foodstuff and for human society. And we're going to conclude these lectures looking at a completely different marine community. And this is a marine community based in the deep ocean. It's a chemosynthetic, these are chemosynthetic communities, and the source of chemical nutrients that allow these communities to exist comes from, not from the hydrothermal vent fluids that we've talked about previously, but from the discharge, the natural discharge of oil, and in this case, asphalt. So this is a lecture that I've previously given for FSU. I gave this lecture to the Department of Biology, and so I'll be sharing it with you today. Before I begin, however, I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask any questions or any of the teams that are concerned or worried about when the presentation will be, or for evaluating the milestone 3 assignment. So if there are any questions on that, please go ahead and ask them now.
Dr. McDonald?
Yes.
For the true or false questionnaire that you'd like us to do, would you like us to just email that to you, or should we post it on Canvas, or what should we do?
Okay, yeah. This is for the true, false, or multiple choice questions that each team will be preparing over the lecture material that they present during their presentation. And there should be 5 questions, either true, false, multiple choice, or fill in the blanks. And so each team should prepare those questions ahead of time and send the questions plus the correct answer and any alternative answers in the case of multiple choice questions. They should be sent to Carrie, and Carrie will upload those to the regular quiz assignment pages that you've been working with, so that the class will be responsible for a quiz over each of the lectures that you hear from your teammates. And so each team, before doing your presentation, should prepare the 5 questions and send them to Carrie, who'll put them online. And then also, because you prepare them ahead of time, that gives you a chance to make sure that you cover those questions during your presentation, so that your fellow students will have a good chance of answering those questions. Okay?
Thank you.
Are there any other questions over that? Go ahead.
Will you be the one that still does all of the hosting of the meetings, or how does it work that when we share our screen?
Yes, what we'll do is I will be hosting the meeting as planned, but that's a good question, and thank you for bringing that up. What I would like to do is to have so we will host the meeting, and then I will designate one member of each team as being a co-host, and then the co-host will be able to upload their presentation and share their screen. I believe you can do that anyway, but it'll be easier with the co-host. And that's something that you need to organize within your teams. So, one person will be showing the slides, and of course, they're not going to be in the same room as their other teammates. So and typically it would be the person who does the introductory and concluding materials. So they would be uploading the presentation, and they should be somebody who has a good, strong internet connection. They should go ahead and they'll share their screen. They'll be in the presenter mode for a PowerPoint or whatever the presentation is. And then when they pass the baton, as it were, to their teammates, the teammates will have to remember to say, "Next slide, please," when it's time to move from one slide to the next. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so that's something to think about within your teams. Think about who is going to be actually uploading and presenting. You don't have to upload, but who's going to be sharing his or her screen with the class during your presentation, and then how you're going to make sure that you do the next slide, the sort of handoff between the different team members. And so that's something that you really need to rehearse so that it'll go smoothly. And normally people rehearse it a little bit, but then when they're in class together up on the front of the room making the presentation, it's really to sort of say to each other or not and indicate when those things are happening. But that's much more difficult to do when we have this large format.
What's up?
Okay, so now I'm going to mute everybody. So I'm going to mute you all. If you need to ask a question, the way to ask a question is to press your space bar, and while you're holding down your space bar, everybody will be able to hear you. So everybody is free to ask questions, but I've muted you so that background noises won't be coming over the speaker. All right, I'm going to start the lecture right now, and this is a lecture. There are about 40 slides. These are uploaded to the regular module for this week, so you can download these slides. This material is not covered, of course, in the Garrison textbook, but I will be uploading a series of questions based over this lecture. Okay, so I'm going to start the lecture now. So I'm going to be describing an ecosystem which exists with large numbers of animals, relatively low biodiversity, and very long-term stability. And this ecosystem, this particular ecosystem, is one type of natural seep ecosystem, natural seep chemosynthetic ecosystem that has recently been discovered, sort of recently, since 2003 was when we discovered and published this ecosystem. It's similar, there are many similarities between the asphalt communities in the southern Gulf of Mexico and oil seep communities in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, asphalt communities do occur, asphalt ecosystems do occur in the northern Gulf of Mexico, but they are particularly widespread and particularly dramatic in terms of the amount of asphalt that you find in the southern Gulf. So I'll be focusing on that. I'll also give you some background information on oil and oil in the ocean. So what we want to do is to consider a brief, very brief geologic history of carbon. And of course, carbon is the molecule, the nutrient that is the basis of all life forms. Anything that we know about, there's nothing that's not carbon-based. And carbon moves through the global ecosystem in many different forms. We're familiar with biomass and biomass cycling. We're familiar with mineralized carbon in the form of calcium carbonate. We've discussed that. And an important class of carbon is the carbon which is generated, fossil carbon, which is what we commonly call oil, gas, coal. These are mineralized, fossilized. This is a fossilized form of organic carbon, which can be burned and maintains its regular organic capabilities. I'll be talking about seeps in the Gulf of Mexico, briefly about natural seeps, and briefly about unnatural seeps, that is to say oil spills, and then gas, oil, brine, ice, chemosynthetic life, and those kinds of features. And we'll turn to the discovery of a site called Chapapote in the southern Gulf of Mexico, which was the first place where we observed this phenomenon of acid volcanism. And then I'm going to present results from an expedition with the German research ship Meteor. So this was the 114th cruise expedition of the German ship Meteor. This took place in 2015, and this was the very latest results that we've gotten from these sites. I'll show you a little video presenting the findings from my colleagues at the University of Bremen in Germany, where they have an extensive program investigating these sites. And then we'll talk about development of oil and gas in the southern Gulf of Mexico and how that situation may have an influence on the well-being and the conservation of oil seeps, of the asphalt oil seeps. So life, as we know, began in shallow seas and continued to thrive in shallow seas. The life that occurred, 100 million years ago, approximately 100 million years ago, made life possible today, because today we depend very, very heavily, almost exclusively, on carbon source as a source of energy and also as a source of building materials, on carbon that was first fixed by photosynthesis, hundreds of millions of years ago. And we were familiar probably with 3 different types of organic carbon. One is coal, and the other is oil, and then the third would be natural gas, methane, ethane, propane, and so forth. All 3 of those forms of carbon, under most circumstances, are derived from photosynthesis and plants, whether they're single-celled algae or trees and ferns that lived millions of years ago. The biomass died, sank to the bottom of the ocean or into the bottom of marshes, was preserved under oxygen-free conditions, and has been transformed over geologic time into the materials that we're familiar with now. So, at different times in the past, marine life has bloomed. When this marine life blooms, one of the things that happens is that CO2 is removed from the atmosphere in very large magnitudes, and that organic carbon is buried. So when that CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, that alters the greenhouse balance of our atmosphere and can actually make the global climate colder. And so, removing CO2 from the atmosphere in a large scale, as was done different times, Devonian, Jurassic times, has had an impact on global climate. And then this carbon, as it's buried, under the heat and pressure of burial, the carbon forms into hydrocarbons, gas and oil. So let's talk a little bit about what hydrocarbons are. Well, this is a geologic chart that goes back 600 million years, and this shows different. I'm going to move this. I can't tell if these little boxes are interfering. Can somebody tell me whether this little box is actually showing up on the screen? I'm looking at a grid view of the speakers, and I don't know if that's covering up part of the display.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. All right, so I can see it, but you all can't. Fine. All right, so this is a chart that shows the global carbon burial. So we said that at different times in geologic past, the carbon has been buried. And this is specifically, in this case, we're referring to carbon that was produced in shallow seas and was preserved in marine sediments. And so you can see that the rates of carbon burial have increased at various times. They've gone up and down. And so 500 million years ago, the climate of the planet was much, much warmer. With the removal of carbon, that would have produced periods of relatively cold conditions. And then as that carbon was recycled, or as conditions changed to put more CO2 into the atmosphere, the temperature would have would have risen again. So these are, this represents the sort of the very, very long-term trend in carbon burial. And then these bars are times when source rock areas were created. And so we can see that there was a big period of source rock creation in Devonian times. And also this is Devonian, this would be Silurian, and this would be Jurassic and Cretaceous burials. And so this would be an Eocene burial. So at different times, there have been large accumulations of this organic material in the geologic pool. And then this is what we're talking about when we talk about hydrocarbons. So when we think about organic material, generally there's an oxygen atom involved in organic matter. And if you think of like sugars and things like that, so hydrocarbons are preserved without any oxygen, and they tend to form together in these chains. And so the simplest hydrocarbon molecule is methane. So that's one carbon molecule and then four hydrogen, one carbon atom and four hydrogen atoms that are bonded to make this methane molecule. So that's the simplest form of hydrocarbons. You can make more complex forms of hydrocarbons if you substitute one of these hydrogen atoms for a second carbon atom with an associated 3 hydrogen atoms bonded to it. And so these are called alkane chains of carbon molecules with carbon atoms with hydrogen atom bonded onto them. So the methane is the simplest. It has 1 carbon. Ethane has 2 carbons. Propane has 3 carbons. Butane has 4. Pentane has 5, etc. And these chains can be very long. So there are alkane chains that have 50 or 100 carbon molecules bonded together in these long straight chains. The typical formula is the number of, so we represent methane as CH4, so 1 carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms. The formula for ethane would be C2H6. So the number of hydrogens in the formula is always twice the number of carbon atoms plus 2 for the end pieces. And so the butane formula would be C4H10, right? Because there are 4 carbon atoms, and each of those 4 carbon atoms has 2 hydrogen atoms, and then the end carbons each has a hydrogen atom bonded to it. So that general formula applies for all of these alkane chains, and alkane is spelled A-L-K-A-N-E. So that's the general story for the production of that. What happens to these hydrocarbons when they're buried is they form shales, preserved material, and these shales are very high organic content. The shale, which is often called source rock, can actually be lighted on fire and it will burn. So source rock is this fossilized form of carbon. And the carbon is, as I said, derived from the production of single-celled organisms. So algae and other single-celled marine organisms sink to the bottom. Their organic material is preserved and buried into layers of shale-like material. And these are buried hundreds, even thousands of meters below the surface of the present-day surface of the ocean floor. And under those conditions, the hydrocarbons are transformed and release their carbon in the form of oil and gas. So the oil and gas tends to migrate upwards through layers of sediment as it forms, and sometimes it gets trapped in formations of porous rock. So this is an example here of hydrocarbons that are being, oil and gas that's migrating up through from source rock that's buried quite deeply, and that oil and gas then accumulates. These little green zones represent areas where the oil and gas is accumulating. So what does it need to accumulate? A reservoir of hydrocarbon, the same kind of reservoir that would be sought after by oil companies wanting to drill into oil and gas. That typically comprises a porous kind of rock. So a rock like gravel, old coral reefs, the rubble from coral reefs, sand from river mouths. So where those kinds of formations occur within the sedimentary record, they can be places where oil and gas can accumulate. And what happens is that the liquid oil, the gaseous hydrocarbons fill the void spaces within this rock. Okay, so that's one component of making a reservoir. But in order to, the oil and gas want to keep migrating. They want to keep rising up towards the surface because they're less dense than the surrounding sedimentary solidified sediments. So to have a economic reservoir of oil or gas, you have to have this porous rock, the trap rock, and then you have to have a cap rock that goes over that. So the cap rock is not porous, it tends to be impermeable. So a thick, a dense shale, in some cases salt, halite crystal salt can act as a cap rock. And so with this capping structure, the porous reservoir stores hydrocarbons for millions, hundreds of thousands, tens of millions of years. And, so these traps, so you can say just as a way of remembering this, that a economic reserve of hydrocarbons, or an economic reserve of oil or the gas, requires three types of rock. One is the source rock. This is the shale that is transformed to release its hydrocarbons. The second is the trap rock, and that's the porous material in which the hydrocarbons accumulate. And then the third rock is the reservoir rock, and then the third rock is the trap rock that seals the reservoir shut so that it can be exploited later on. So this is what these economic reservoirs are what industry looks for in order to produce oil and gas for industrial and consumer uses. And because this production took place in ocean margins, in the geologic past, ocean margins are a good place to look for oil. And the modern era of oil production began on the Texas coast when they decided to drill into a mound, an anticline called Spindletop, and they struck one of these highly pressured reservoirs after drilling down just a few tens of feet and produced the giant Texas gusher, the sort of the mother of all gushers, which occurred back in, I believe, 1905 was when that event occurred. So, and to this day, oceans continue to be a good place to produce hydrocarbons. So this is a skipjack. This is a pump that's pulling hydrocarbons out of a reservoir, and this pump operates at a sort of slow pressure. You've probably seen these things. This thing goes up and down, and as it goes up and down, there's a piston that's drawing the oil up. The oil is often very thick and viscous, and the oil is pulled up, and then the downward pressure. So the upward pressure pulls the oil out of the reservoir, and the downward pressure forces that oil into a storage tank nearby. So oil and gas, it's trapped in the porous rock. These traps are economic reservoirs, and for the entire modern era, oil companies have been drilling into reservoirs associated with present-day ocean basins or geologic ocean basins. So we talk about the Permian Basin in Texas as being a very important oil-producing area. And this is not a present-day ocean, of course, but it was an ocean in the geologic past. And the reservoirs that are found there were created and formed in the same way as our reservoirs in the present-day ocean. So, but not all the oil and gas that accumulates in traps stays in traps. A certain amount of it escapes. And what I'm showing you here, I think this will play. Yeah, so this is a site in Siberia, and this is an accidental escape of hydrocarbons. So what was happening is they decided to drill a well, an oil well. They drilled into this oil well, and they found some gas, and they weren't expecting the gas. They didn't have a good way to flare it off. So somebody had the bright idea of, let's light it on fire, and that'll burn it off, and that'll let us go back to pumping oil and gas. Well, that decision was made something like 20 years ago, and the oil and the gas in particular has been escaping ever since. And this is a fire that nobody can put out, and this will burn, perhaps for a century or more until all of the oil and gas in that reservoir is used up. So that gives you a sense of a couple of things here. A sense that once this migration starts, it's once the cap rock is breached, the oil and the gas can continue to escape from the reservoir under pressure, and also that the volumes are enormous. So think of how much is being burned here, on an hourly basis, and imagine that going on for decades. So
Wait,
yeah.
Still burning right now?
Yes, this is still burning right now. So this is something that was done, I think, back in the 90s or something like that. They had this accident, and it continues to burn until the present day. Yes, so that's one of the things that happens. These are very, very long-term events.
Is anybody liable for it, or like any of the damage? Does the company that did that, are they responsible for any damage done?
Well, this was in Russia, and so it's a state-owned, and I think when it was done, it was before the fall of the Soviet Union, so this was a state-owned corporation. So in this case, under the laws of that country, there's no particular responsible party. If this were the United States, there might be some fines and sanctions brought to bear. But I believe there's no, they just sort of had to abandon this site and say, well, too bad, that didn't work out.
Does something like this give off any sort of emissions?
Yes, of course. It's, there's not all the gas burns, and there's the combustion products are released. There's a lot of methane that escapes to the atmosphere from this. So yes, this is a long-term release. The fact that it's on fire means that there's less methane escaping than might otherwise do. But of course, this is not a good neighborhood for doing anything else, because you've got this perpetual fire burning away. And, and there's, there are sort of perpetual flames that naturally occur in Turkey and Greece and other places where there are similar sorts of natural gas seeps that have in one way or another ignited and continue to burn. And it's speculated that the burning bush, that's mentioned in the Bible, where, which spoke to Moses, that might have been a natural seep like this that was set on fire. In any event, these things do occur. And so, less dramatic seeps are also found widely. So this is a seep of oil. This is in a little river in Alaska, and you can clearly see that the oil is sort of bubbling up from underground and is being released in this little pool here. So back in the day, before we had expensive, fancy technical means for looking for oil and gas, the wildcatters, the explorationists who were trying to find new oil reservoirs, would look for these natural seeps. And I mentioned the Spindletop oil boom in Texas, near Beaumont, Texas. One of the things that gave them the idea that they would be able to drill for oil there was, there was a sulfur spring there, and it was naturally releasing oil. And so they thought, well, maybe there's some oil down deep in the ground if we drill into that. And so that was the clue that they had. So natural seeps are an important indicator that prospectors can use when they're looking for oil. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico, as you know, is a product of plate tectonism in the present day. So we know that in the late Triassic, Pangaea was starting to break up. Early Jurassic, we were starting to get the continents move apart. Into the early Cretaceous, there was a seaway, a pan-ocean seaway near the equator that opened up, and so there was as the North American continent separated from South America and Africa. So this is present-day South America. This is present-day Africa. So as they were separating, there was a seaway here. And then, in the late Eocene, so about 20 million years ago or so, this isthmus came together, and I think at about 3 million years before the present-day isthmus closed off, and so that created this Gulf of Mexico. But from the early Jurassic all the way through the late Eocene, the basin that eventually became the Gulf of Mexico would repeatedly open and close, and so the sill here through which water flowed would be sometimes open, and so the seawater would flood in here, and other times it was closed, and so the seawater that had filled this basin would then evaporate and leave behind the dissolved solids that are associated with seawater. And so this process is called the solids that remain after you evaporate seawater is called evaporite, and the evaporite deposits that accumulated over this 200 million year history are very, very abundant in the Gulf of Mexico as salt. And so as a consequence of this history, the Gulf of Mexico and other parts of the eastern margin of the North and South America include very, very substantial deposits of salt, which are buried under many thousands of meters of sediments typically. So most people are familiar with salt domes in Louisiana and Texas. Well, that's the salt that forms these domes was laid down during as a result of this process over several hundred million years. And we can get a look at how this works if we consider a present-day example. And so this is the Caspian Sea, and this is the Kara-Bogaz Gulf, the Gulf of Kara-Bogaz. And some years ago, and I guess in 1980 or so, this little gulf was closed off from the rest of the Caspian Sea. And so there was no longer circulation between these two bodies of water. And as a consequence, since there was no inflowing fresh water, all of the seawater in this little gulf dissolved, and you can see that it's left behind this sort of white powdery material. Well, this is salt, and salt has this crystalline form. And so, and of course, sodium chloride, salt forms a salt when it dries out, and that salt is has a natural formation of a crystal. Well, crystals are incompressible. Crystals, no matter once they've formed, you can't change their density by putting them under pressure, because that's the fundamental form that they take. That stability of density does not apply to sediments, and so if this present-day evaporite deposit were buried under progressively deeper layers of sediment, over time the salt would be subject to very high pressures, but it wouldn't change in density. However, the accumulating sediments do change in density. So this is pretty easy to understand, that as you start packing, clay and silt and fine particles of sediment together under the pressure at the bottom of an increasingly deep column of sediments, they're going to be packed together closer and closer. And part of that packing together means that muds and clays consolidate into solid rock-like material. That rock becomes denser and denser, as the sediment accumulates. And so in the Gulf, there are, several thousand meters of sediment, and underlying that several thousand meters of sediment are another 1,000 or 2 meters of salt. So the characteristics of the Gulf of Mexico are a very, this salt deposit, which is very old and very thick, overlain by an even thicker layer of sediments. Well, at a burial depth of about 1,500 meters, the mean density of sediments gets to be greater than the constant density of salt. And so as this happens, in relative terms, the salt is more buoyant than the sediment, compared. And so the salt actually starts to move out of its position And what's happening, as we always know when we think about buoyancy, it's not the less buoyant material that's sort of somehow magically going upward. It's that the less buoyant material, the denser material, is sinking down around that low density void and forcing it upward. And so you can get an idea there if you've thought about, stepping into mud with bare feet. So the mud doesn't, change in density because you step on it, but the mud has to go somewhere and it gets squeezed up between your toes. Well, that's what happens to the salt. It behaves as a liquid over geologic time, and it's squeezed out of position by this accumulating sediment layer. So this is a cartoon sort of illustrating that process. So here is the salt layer, and these are the accumulating sediments, and they're pushing down, forcing the salt upward. And then, as it goes upward, it may intersect these reservoirs of hydrocarbons. So it may intersect previously existing oil and gas reservoirs. And it can also, salt is also a good trap rock, so you can get accumulations of hydrocarbons underneath layers of salt. So if we put all this together, here is this is a 3D seismic display. So this is using 3D seismic acoustic instruments to look down into the layers of sediments below the surface, below the bottom of the ocean. This is a site called GC 600. And so what you're seeing here is a body of salt, and you can see that the salt has a very different sort of texture from the surrounding sediments. And in these sediments, you see these layers, these striations here. These record different periods when sediments were accumulating at different rates within the Gulf. So here you can see very clearly this idea of the heavy sediments pushing down and then forcing the salt upward. And this label here, this is alloctinous salt. There are two types of salt domes. There's an alloctinous salt dome, and then there's an autochthonous. So A-L-L-O-C-H, alloctinous, and then autochthonous, spelled like auto, A-U-T-O, T-O-N-O-U-S. So autochthonous salt is separated from the underlying layer. Okay, so that's the idea of a salt dome. So here's an actual picture of a salt dome, and it's a little hard to get a sense of scale here, but the total depth is just about 2,500 meters, actually about 1,500 meters to the bottom here, and the length scale. This is representing about 50 kilometers of distance from one end of the display to another. And so the vertical axis is greatly exaggerated in this. Okay, you can also see these black lines. Well, these are interpretations of the data, and what these are showing are faults. So as the sediments are consolidated into a rock-like material, it's brittle, and so when the salt pushes on it, it has to give way, and it creates these faults. And so these faults allow hydrocarbons to migrate out of the traps that they're in and up towards the surface. So that's one picture that we have here. Well, here's another picture. So this is a series of reservoirs, series of oil and gas reservoirs, and they're down about 1,000 meters below the mud line, below the bottom of the ocean. And you can see that there's bright reflectors in here indicating the material that's highly reflective, and that's indicative of oil and gas. And you also see these red lines. So these red lines are all converging towards the surface, and what you actually have here is a oil platform, if you go all the way up to the surface here. So this is an oil platform, and each one of these red lines is an individual well that the platform has drilled down in to tap into this reservoir. So here you have and then this site, which I'm going to show you in a minute, this is the natural seat. The seafloor is right about here, I should have explained. So this is the present-day seabed. And this is just the top of the display. So right here, at this where this arrow is pointing down, is a place where a fault is intersecting the bottom of the ocean. Hydrocarbons are migrating up along the side of this salt dome, and they go all the way to the surface. So that's a natural seep process. And then here is the unnatural process of hydrocarbon extraction from this reservoir by an oil-producing platform. So here we are in this GC600 site, and this is a video made, video with a camera system that I deployed. And so here you can see bubbles of oil and gas, escaping through the seabed and then rising up through the water column. So the oil is dark in color, and the gas is sort of, you can see the little bubbles, they're going by kind of fast. And then you can also see, it's a little hard to see, but there's there's something going on. There's some kind of other material in here. And what this other material is gas hydrate. So this is an ice-like substance that forms when methane and water combine at low pressure, at low temperature. So the temperature on the bottom here would probably be about 6 degrees Celsius. So that's a low temperature, but it's warmer than freezing. But the pressure here is going to be 150 bar, because you're at a depth of 1,500, this is about 1,100 meters depth here. And so the features in this picture are the sort of normal sediments, gas hydrate, and the oil and gas that's bubbling through here. And I'll just point out this little creature here. This is one of my favorite animals. This is what we call the ice worm. Its scientific name is Hesiosica methanicola. And the ice worms are found on these gas hydrate substrate. You can see that there's something moving here. So that's just one indication of the fact that this supports a rich biological community. And then these white chunks around here, these are actually not rocks, but this ice-like substance, which we call gas hydrate.
Does the oil and gas that come from this have any negative effects?
So you're saying, does it inhibit sea life? Yeah, there probably are animals that don't like the oil. But what we find is that, contrary to sort of the intuitive idea you might have, there's actually a abundant community of organisms which are adapted to be able to not only withstand any toxicity of the oil, but also to thrive by utilizing the chemical energy that's released if we oxidize that oil. So the next couple of slides explain how that ecosystem works. So natural seeps are seeps that are caused by leaky traps. And so we have a reservoir that's trapping oil and gas, and then you have faults or other features that allow the oil and gas to leak out. So, as the hydrocarbons, the oil and gas, as they rise up through the, most of the, hundreds of meters of sediments, they're not really transformed a great deal. However, when they get close to the seabed, the temperature actually decreases, so they get colder. The thermal gradient is actually, temperature increases by about 1 degree for every 100 feet of burial. So it actually gets quite warm when you're deep in the sediments. And then, as it migrates through these faults, there really isn't any water initially. And so one of the things that happens as the hydrocarbons approach the seafloor is that water becomes available, and the oil and gas is subject to being mixed with water. When that water becomes available, some of the methane can freeze into these methane hydrates, and the hydrates can attract small amounts of oil. And then the other thing that happens is that, so here you have this, near the seabed, you have this really, really oily, anoxic layer of sediments. Well, that would be a habitat that many marine organisms would avoid. The normal deep sea macrofauna would find those conditions toxic. But there are other specially adapted microbial bacteria and archaea that are able to utilize the chemical energy in the oil and gas under those anoxic conditions. And so what this cartoon shows here is the oil and gas reservoir, and similar to the picture that you saw in the seismograph from GC600. Here's the fault zone penetrating upward there. And then here we're following the fault, up toward the sea floor. And then, we're looking, so this gets bigger and bigger. And then you have this, this community that is being supported by these oil and gas and sediments. And this community comprises an animal known as the tube worm. I'll get to that in a second, but the oil and gas that rises up through the water column, so some of that, you saw that video of oil and gas escaping at GC600, well, that same oil and gas rises up to the surface. And so this is an echogram of the seabed. The water depth here is about 500 meters. And these dark zones here, these are clouds of bubbles of gas and oily, so oily bubbles, drops of oil, and so forth. And they're the echogram, the acoustic energy from the echo sounder hits these bubbles and reflects backwards, so that you see this back to the instrument. So you see this, this dark trace in the water here. And so you can see that the bubbles are migrating onto the seabed and making it all the way to the surface. Now, when those drops of oil get to the surface, they immediately spread out into very, very thin layers. And the layers of oil actually get so thin that they don't have any color. They're less than half a micron in thickness, so that's thinner than the thinnest wavelength, smallest wavelength of visible light. So you're not actually able to see any color. Initially, there's a sort of a rainbow color to it, but then as the oil continues to spread out and become thinner and thinner, all that you're seeing here is not, you're not seeing the oil, but you're seeing the effect that the oil has on the ocean surface. So what's happening in these bright, shiny areas here is that the floating layer of oil has flattened out the capillary waves, the little wind ripples, the very small waves. And so that makes the area covered by the oil a more mirror-like, has a more mirror-like aspect. And so the surface of the ocean literally becomes slick in appearance. And so these are called oil slicks. And then what happens is that if the sun is hitting those oil slicks at the right angle, it gets reflected back to the viewer, and you see this bright pattern of reflected light generated. So this is a picture taken from an airplane flying at about 1,000 feet above the site. Here's a ship, which is about 150 feet in length. So it gives you sort of some sense of how big this feature is. And then, this is the resulting oil slick, and you can see that it's coming to the surface here, and then it's drifting downstream. So that's one picture of that. Well, here's another picture of oil slicks from similar region. This was not taken from an airplane. This was actually taken from a space shuttle, but you're seeing the exact same phenomenon of very long layers of oil that are coming to the surface and then drifting downstream with wind and current in these long streamers. And so, we discovered this. This was something that I was aware of, that we had seen this. I had seen these kind of features during work at sea. And then in the 1990s, shortly after I finished my PhD, I was exploring in the Earth and Planetary Science Library in Houston, where they had all of the photographs that had been taken from all of the manned spacecraft, the space shuttle and the Apollo program and so forth. And so I started looking through pictures that had been taken from the space shuttle of the Gulf of Mexico, and I started spotting these oil slicks. And I realized that it was possible to see oil slicks from space, and that these oil slicks, even though they're tiny features in the scale that the photographs were covering, each one of these little origin points here, and we call these oil slick origins, or OSOs. Each one of these represented one of those streams of bubbles, just like you're seeing in this picture here. And so that gave me the idea that we could potentially use oil slicks as a way of mapping where there are natural seeps across the whole of the Gulf of Mexico. And pursuing that has been a major component of the research that I've done for the rest of my career. And so I'm sharing with you here some of the results from that career, and that all sort of stems back to, an afternoon in the library or the archives at the center there in Houston, and looking through, there were long rolls of I guess 60 millimeter film, so big wide strips of film that we would look at on a light table with a magnifying glass, very different from how it would be done today. But looking at these pictures and realizing, that what I was seeing was, the sort of the large scale result of this very small scale process that I had already been investigating from submarines. Okay, and so this just sort of gives you a little more material. So these are not photographs. So the previous images I showed you were photographs. These are a different sort of image, and these are made by satellites that are using radar energy to image the surface of the ocean. And the resulting phenomenon is very similar, is exactly the same as the sun glint patterns, except that the energy that's being reflected here is radar energy. And so these dark patches here are oil slicks being detected by radar. And what I'm trying to point out here is, we have a series of images that were collected over a 10-year time frame. So in 1997, we had these 4 little origins, oil slick origins here. And then we came in 2002, like 5 years later. And here's the same 4 origins of oil. And then here in 2006, so 10 years later, here again are the same 4. So these represent, each one of these is a natural seep on the seabed. And you can see that over 10 years, they've continued to produce oil. Now, of course, the expression of the oil slick, or the direction and the shape of the oil slick that was imaged, in the 3 different scenes shown here, that depends on the conditions on the particular day when that image was taken. So on this day, the oil slicks are going in this direction. On this day, they're going in the opposite direction, and so forth. The pattern of the geographic pattern of where these slicks are is unchanged, and that's kind of remarkable. And so if we take this and put all 3 of them together, so here's the blue, here's the red, here's the yellow, and what we can do is to take the geographic average of these 4 points and say, well, that's the center of this seep zone. And so, if you just see some sort of dark feature in a radar image, it could be oil, or it could be, like something that a ship had dumped, or it could be floating sargassum or some other phenomenon. But if you see it in the same place, in the same configuration multiple times, then that's a pretty good indication that you're looking at a persistent source of natural oil in this part of the world. So it's a simple idea, but it's, if you apply it carefully and consistently and rigorously, it can give you a very good picture of where the natural seeps are in the Gulf. So here's a map of, about 1,000 individual seep zones, like the one I just showed you, mapped out across the Gulf of Mexico. And what you can see here is that there's a big concentration of natural seeps off the coast of Louisiana in what we would call the northwestern quarter of the Gulf. So I've divided the Gulf here into 4 quadrats: northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest. And you can see that there are oil slicks in 3 of these areas. There are very few natural seeps off the coast of Florida, a few in this part of the world, but almost none down here. And that's indicative of a very different geologic history for the Eastern Gulf than it was in the Western Gulf. So there's a thick cluster here. And this red dot, I'll talk more about that. This is the location of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. And so you can see that there's a cluster of natural seeps around this area. And that's, you know, one of the reasons that, that BP was choosing to drill in this area was because it was known to be a region that hosted a number of oil reservoirs. Of course, they had a very, very different outcome from natural seeps, but this is by way of showing that. And you can also see that there are clusters of natural seep zones in the southern Gulf of Mexico, specifically the southwest quadrat, where the this is called the Bay of Campeche. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay. So 3 zones, most of the oil in the northwest, some in the southwest, a bit in the southeast, in the northeast rather, very little in the southeast. And this map here, this is a sort of a depiction of the average area of oil slicks in each of these grid cells. So these are 10 by 10 kilometer grids. And, you know, this is the percentage of that grid that was covered by oil on average when, you know, based on looking at several hundred of these natural seeps images, synthetic aperture radar images. So if we think about, you know, if we compare, so if we use this as a basis for comparing the output of oil, we can see that the northwestern Gulf of Mexico, this portion here, comprises about 69% of the total oil, natural oil released in the Gulf. The southwest, about 24%. The northeast, where the Deepwater Horizon spill happened, was only about 7% of the natural oil slicks that we saw. And the southeast has you know, almost none. Very, very little oil released naturally. Well, you know, what does that mean? So here's a map of, you know, pipelines from 2000, I guess this is updated 2011. And, you know, what you can see is the industrial exploitation of all these oil reservoirs. You can see a couple of things here. You know, a lot of things concentrated along the coast, and these are sort of the older areas of drilling and production. And then as these reservoirs were, you know, reduced or exhausted, in order to keep producing oil, the oil companies had to move further and further offshore. And of course, when they start getting offshore, they don't want to be bringing the oil that they produce offshore back home in ships. They want to make pipelines. And so each one of these yellow lines is a pipeline that goes from, it's connected to these oil production platforms. So the oil is produced on these red dots, which are platforms, and it's, you know, water and other impurities are removed. Those impurities are pumped back down into the wells, and then the oil is piped in these pipelines back to refineries and collection points on land. And, you know, you can see that here that over time, you know, the drilling has progressed into deeper and deeper waters. And so the Deepwater Horizon spill was right around here. And that's an area where, you know, when they drilled the Deepwater Horizon, that was very, very deep water, relatively deep water. And they drilled very, very deeply into the sediments in order to exploit the reservoir there. Gas hydrate is an ice-like substance that forms when H2O and CO and methane are combined. I've already talked about that. You know, this is the ice worm that I talked about, the Asiacica mesnanicola, and these animals make a living by browsing bacteria. So this is that ice-like gas hydrate. And the gas hydrate, as I said, can be lit on fire. So gas hydrate is the ice that burns. And then these are some of the tube worms, which are you know, supported. So these are tube worms just like the hydrothermal vent tube worms, except they have much smaller plumes, and they're extracting their reduced compounds, their sulfide compounds, from the buried portions of their tubes, which are down in the mud. So this is very sulfidic mud. And so the tube worms are able to get this H2S absorbed in these sediments. and then they combine that H2S with oxygen. By oxidizing the H2S, they get a little burst of energy, and that burst of energy is used to fix new carbon. So that's done by bacteria, and then bacterial and archaeal consortium, and then bacteria go ahead and oxidize that H2S and the bacterial symbionts, and there are billions of symbionts inside each one of these tube worms, and their production is what provides foodstuff for the tube worm hosts. There are also mussels that are able to use gas, so they have symbionts that can use gas in the same process, methane gas, and their methane symbionts are maintained in these gills. We've explored these sites with submarines, so I've been very privileged in my career to make many dives in each of these different submarines. This is the Navy nuclear submarine NR1. It doesn't exist any longer, but it used to be able to dive down to depths of 3,000 feet. Actually, it probably went deeper, but the deepest I ever went was 3,000 feet. There would be a crew of typically 12 plus 1 or 2 scientists. There were 4 beds, and then the scientists slept on a rack up here in the, hanging from the ceiling. A very, very tiny space, and we would be out sometimes 2 weeks at a time, very cramped quarters, not a possibility of being able to shave and lots of or shower or anything like that. But the wonderful thing was that you could lie on the floor, the 3 little portholes here in this special compartment underneath, where the steering wheel and navigation components were. So you could lie on your stomach and look out these 3 portholes, as the submarine drove along about 10 feet off the bottom, and watch for hours and hours and hours as the seafloor went by, and see things that nobody had ever seen and probably nobody will ever see again. This is a second submarine. This is a Johnson Sea Link. This is much different in principle. There was an acrylic sphere here, 6 feet in diameter, 2 passengers, a pilot and a passenger. And this was battery operated. It also had a maximum operating depth of 3,000 feet. Here's one of those clusters of tube worms, and you can get a sense of scale here. So this sphere is 6 feet in diameter, and you can see that the tube worm, this cluster of tube worms, sometimes called a tube worm bush, is even bigger than this sphere. So that gives you a sense of how much biomass is here. And then this is a third type of submarine that was used. This is the submarine Alvin, which I've already talked about a little bit, and that's been used in the Gulf of Mexico quite a bit as well. Well, okay, so that's the northern Gulf of Mexico, and the time I have left, I want to talk about the southern Gulf. To make a long story short, I combined with colleagues and friends from the University of Bremen in Germany, and we decided to explore areas where we knew there were natural oil slicks, but we had no information about what was on the bottom there. So the first expedition was with the German ship Zona that went out in 2003. That explored this portion of the Gulf during that expedition. And this is a map of some of the sites that we saw. So these are mounds on the seabed. And then these little dots are places where we saw natural oil slicks. And so, because it was very tightly organized, we decided to focus on one of these sites. This site was called Chapapote. And this region is called the Campeche Knolls. The knolls refer to these mound-like formations. We were exploring. This is the middle of the night, 3 in the morning. We were driving along. Everybody thought it was very, very boring. And then suddenly this big layer of material that nobody had ever seen came into view. And we all started shouting and taking pictures and trying to figure out what we were seeing. This didn't look like anything like the carbonate rocks that I was familiar with from other seeps. And it had this sort of strange fracture pattern, kind of radial patterns. But what convinced me that we might be looking at something chemosynthetic is that I could see, as we got toward the edge, you'll just see it when we get over to the other side. So we kept going and going. This whole thing is about 12 or 13 meters across, so a very large feature. This is being taken, the pictures are being taken from this photo sled here, not from a submarine. And so the guy was operating this, had to reel in on the winch to keep this thing from running into the bottom. And then as we leave the bottom here, along the edge here, you can see that there are tube worms. sticking out from the underside here. So I recognized the tube worms. I didn't recognize this, but we knew we'd found something significant. Well, what had we found? We had found these are some of the pictures taken from that same transit here. And this material we realized was not rock, it was actually asphalt. Here are the tube worms that we saw sticking out from the edge of that. So what's happening here is the tube worms are, there's an anoxic mud with high sulfide content, and the tube worms are sticking the ends of their tubes underneath this, and they're extracting the H2S, and then their little plumes here are able to oxidize that. So just a few pictures of what this looks like. We've made a number of expeditions to this site. I want to focus on the most recent expedition. Here are some more pictures of this. You can see how dramatic these formations are, and how deformed they are. Some of them are literally hundreds of meters across. So these are, this is an example of new hard substrate being formed in the deep ocean, which is a very rare process. You have it at hydrothermal vents, of course, where there's basalt being generated, but this is a form of asphalt, and we named this asphalt volcanism. So here's a little video showing, just sort of driving along through this feature. You get a sense of, what it's like to explore these sites. And Marum is the group there. I'll show you some more videos later. And you can see that there are abundant crabs and other material. This is the edge of one of these sites. And you can see how there's an abrupt transition from the sediments, which are fairly relatively lifeless and featureless, to these asphalt deposits. Let's see, next slide. All right, the time I have left, I want to talk about this expedition in 2015, and I'm going to show you a brief video that describes some of the results here. Let me skip past this. This is showing the magnitude of natural seepage. The natural seepage, magnitude of natural seepage is about 500,000 barrels of oil per year coming up out of all the different seeps. All right, so here's a video from this, and this has got sound, so go ahead and make sure that you're getting the sound out of this. We'll start in a minute here. It takes about 10 minutes or so, and then that will be the conclusion of this lecture. So what you're looking at here is our deposit of this asphalt, and this white material is a combination of sulfur, and then you can see shrimp and crabs browsing this site.
The Gulf of Mexico is a huge basin, deep basin, that has a thick sediment sequence, deposits underlain by salt deposits, which are massive. The salt is very important because the massive salt deposits are moving upwards because of the heavy load on top. They are less denser than the sediments, and because of those diapirs, they are forming traps where the hydrocarbons, which are always moving, also moving upwards, are trapped. The seafloor has typical knolls and ridges that are formed by these diapirs. The knolls are from single diapirs, and the ridges are from elongated diapiric walls. I think this correlation between the gas flares and the oil drops and the slicks with the knolls and with the morphological structures on the seafloor is really unique, because there is a perfect matching of both, and I think this is wonderful.
To take advantage of the fact that gas bubbles do show up in a very specific way in ecograms. So they rise up vertically or slightly deflected by water currents, and they have a very flame-like image in these hydroacoustic ecograms, and this is why we commonly call them flares.
So this is a picture of oil slicks here. You can see them rising up to the surface, and this is a particular sort of echogram that the Germans use that's very focused and allows you to see these flares. They explored this site with a couple of different kind of vehicles. This is an autonomous vehicle called an AUV, And then this is an ROV, so this is a remotely operated vehicle. And this is lowered down on a long umbilical cord and operated remotely by pilots on the surface. And you can see it descending through the water here and going down. So here's the umbilical cable that's going up. Well, here it is sitting on the bottom.
And hydrocarbon seeps in the northern Gulf of
This
Mexico,
guy,
the oil and the gas are coming out of relatively small vents. These are features on the seafloor that are a few tens of centimeters to a few meters across. And the chemosynthetic fauna, the tube worms, the mussels, the clams, and the other animals that depend on the hydrocarbon seepage tend to be concentrated around these relatively small vents. The situation is different at the asphalt volcanoes because the asphalt moves across the sea floor for tens of meters from its source. And as it does so, it creates this chemosynthetic habitat far from the actual vent.
This is a map. We're going to zoom in here from different scales.
So basically, when you want to image the seafloor, you need to take pictures, but with single pictures, you cannot see a very large area because of the absence of natural light and also the attenuation of artificial light and also the turbidity of the water. Then it's not realistic, or it's difficult to take a clear pictures of the seafloor from an altitude of more than 5 meters.
So they get around that. So this is the ROV going along. You'll see it take a picture here.
So what we do is that we need to take several pictures in order to map larger areas. And we need to make sure that the pictures are taken at constant altitude above the seafloor, so about 2 to 5 meters. And then we need to ensure that there is overlap between the different pictures so that we can then later align them and blend them together into a single mosaic image.
So that series of 10 or 12 pictures is now tied together into a long sort of image strip. And then that image strips are tied together into a much larger picture. So this is an optical picture of the sea floor that covers, the area of a football field.
One is that it's a continuous flow, where the asphalt really moves continuously over time, but in a very slow way that we cannot really see. And the other one is that it erupts in pulses, and that the asphalt would flow relatively fast from the outlet towards the edge of the flow.
At more the rim of these asphalt fields, we find very more older and weathered type of asphalts that are more blocky and sedimented in appearance. But then as we fly over into the more central part of the asphalt beds, we find more fresher type of asphalt where we observe asphalt whips that are often colonized by microbial mats. And we can also see many other type of organism associated to it.
So this is a very large feature, and it seems to record a number of separate, discharges of asphalt that cover one over the other.
So the tube worms that we observe between the flows of asphalt and in the cracks in the asphalt tend to grow very slowly. We believe that they grow in the order of less than a centimeter per year. So maybe they could be used to assess how old the eruption is. But the only bushes that we see are towards the outside of the field, which would suggest then that the tube worms might be used as a proxy for the age of the eruption.
So now we're going to look at some of these features. One thing is that there's a close resemblance between lava and the form of rocks, and that's not accidental because when molten lava is discharged, the outer shell solidifies. And then as lava continues to flux into the core, it cracks and spreads and then starts to fracture. And this produces characteristic formations of lava. The same feature happens in asphalt, but asphalt is buoyant. So it can flow out of these cracks and make sort of whips and chains that come up. And also tube worms can colonize the cracks. And so this is a picture. Here's one of these whips of oil. Here's another look at that. And the tube worms are sticking down in the cracks, and everything is sort of folded and fissured, and the asphalt forms these very strange shapes.
Why the asphalt changes from viscous and sticky at the center of the flows to broken and brittle on the outside, we have to look at the chemistry of the oils. So some of them are more like oil that we know of from, it floats on top of water. The fresh asphalt is more viscous and sticky and can be easily bent, while the more weathered asphalt is more crumbly and brittle. And we can also see these changes in the chromatograms. So now when we compare these two chromatograms, we can see that some compounds are present in the fresh and sticky asphalt that are not found anymore in the weathered asphalt. And we can assign these losses of hydrocarbons to different processes. Now, the removal of alkanes is more associated to microbial consumption, whereas the removal of the more polar aromatic hydrocarbons can be more associated to physical weathering, such as water washing.
Here's a look at a site. This is a camera, and you can see the flow of
First,
bubbles.
we know that this gas is mostly made of methane, but we also have indications that there are some higher hydrocarbons involved, like propane, for example. So this is one indication that this is from the same source as the asphalt and the oil. So what is important about methane is that at very high pressures and low temperatures, it forms together with water an ice-like structure called gas hydrates. And these are very deep seep sites, so they are more than 3,000 meter water depth, and there's also very cold water. So that means that we can literally watch gas hydrate crystals form around those gas bubbles.
So here's a picture. And so when you see some of these deposits, they still look like frozen bubbles, which indicates that they form very quickly. And they're also massive, massive, much, much bigger than anything that we were familiar with from the northern Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that there's an abundant community. There's a fish here, many of the mussels, which of course we know are dependent on oil, a variety of gastropods. These shrimp are very numerous and abundant. Here is the ice worm. This is the Hesiosika methanicola ice worm. Now I've speeded up so we can see what these guys are doing over time. So they browse across the surface, and they actually were able to form tunnels that enter into so the tunnels penetrate inside the features of the gas hydrate. And you can see this ice worm crawling from one tunnel to another across the surface of the exposed ice. But when you slow it down, it's really hard to tell what they're doing.
So the first time the ROV showed pictures of this seep site, we were amazed about these huge fields of tube worms. None of us have ever seen such large fields before, and they cover sometimes even thousands of square meters.
So this is the gas hydrate, and with the tube worms growing on top of them, you can see clouds of bubbles being released from this site. And it gives you a sense of just how much structure is being generated. Here's another site where there's more oil present, but there's also gas hydrate here. So there's a tremendous amount of variety in the way that these seeps appear. There's collecting this oil, so using a little sort of funnel-like device to capture it. Here's a remarkable site. This is tube worms. And then this is a gas hydrate deposit, but this particular gas hydrate is all mixed with oil. So that's what, instead of having that white snow-like appearance, it looks sort of dirty, and that's because there's this strange sort of mixture of gas hydrate, with oil drops, fused through it. And this is not, a compound or a substance that we would have imagined could occur until we actually went down and observed what was going on there. And of course, the bubbles, rose to the surface. You can see that they're sort of freezing into little, snow crystals or hailstones as they rise up to the water, and then they go all the way up to the surface and form these oil slicks that we can see by satellites, which give us a chance to find it. Okay, well, that's the conclusion of this video here. I acknowledge all the shipmates and people that helped. You can see these little shrimp, albinocarid shrimp, and they're very busy. They're picking up little pieces of bacteria and little pieces of asphalt off the surface and ingesting those. And so they're able to, support very high biomass. And this picture here is described in this multi-author paper. I was an author on this paper, and I composed this video. Okay, well, that pretty much concludes what I have time for today. Let me, I'll say that I just wanted to say a couple of things. That there have been findings of asphalt in the northern Gulf of Mexico. So this is something that we found in 2014. There are other sites where it's known around the world. They're planning to expand oil and gas drilling in the southern Gulf of Mexico. And so one of the concerns is that that process should try to avoid impacting the chemosynthetic communities that occur at these sites for two reasons. First of all, because you wouldn't want to damage these, these very unusual, important biological resources, and also there would be a hazard associated with drilling into one of these sites. So it would be possible to generate one of these natural oil spills or unnatural oil spills by drilling into this site. So there's a hope that the Mexican government will be able to learn from experiences elsewhere and to manage this thing. All right, well, I'm going to have to stop the lecture here because we're out of time, but I do want to give a minute or two for questions. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and ask now.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
It's about the asphalt. Is that just sediment and oil? Is that all it is?
Well, there's sediment involved, but it's principally oil. And
really,
what happens is that oil is a very, very complex compound. It contains millions of different molecules. Here at the High Magnetic Field Laboratory, they use high magnetic field instruments to break apart oil and gas, and they can identify upward of 1 million different compounds in a typical oil sample. So what happens over time, and this is what was referred to in the video, is that the portions of the oil, the lighter fraction, the more volatile fractions of the oil, are dissolved into the water or consumed otherwise, and what's left behind is the very dense, thick material, which we call asphalt. And so these asphalts are hydrocarbon, but they're hydrocarbon in which all of the the more volatile components have been consumed or degraded over time, leaving behind this solid. And so, yeah, there is sediments mixed in. And so the asphalt that you find in our roads here, that's a mixture of lighter oil with sand. But the asphalts that we find at the asphalt volcanoes is just this very dense material that's sort of oil which has been transformed geologically.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, well, I'll conclude the lecture here right now, and I will we'll have a sign-up sheet for presentations. Student presentations start on Thursday, and Carrie and I will be working. There's a couple of groups that I've looked at that seem to be pretty much ready to go with their presentations, and so we'll have 3 presentations to be announced on Thursday. Each one of those presentations will have a 5-question multiple choice true-false quiz over the material there. I will be putting up a 10-question quiz over the material that I covered in this lecture. So the grades that you have outgoing are the grade that you get for your milestone 3, milestone 4, all the quizzes, and then the take-home or the online final that you'll also be taking. And just as a comment about the final, I think we'll be doing the final with the same format as we've done the quizzes. So you'll be able to look at the material, the questions, and answer them online. But of course, there'll only be 1 attempt allowed. So that's how we'll do it. All right, everybody stay safe, and you feel free to email if you have any questions. Goodbye now.